Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Timlin, and thank you for joining me for this L2DL presentation titled Moving Beyond Experiencing Through Second Language Digital Interaction. I'm currently Assistant Director for Technology in the Center for Language Studies and lecturer at Brown University, and I'm excited to share my research with you all for Circle's 2020 Second Language Digital Literacy Symposium. In this presentation, I'll describe an original research study that involved observing and analyzing how language learners, specifically here German as a foreign language learners, navigate and actively use language during digital multiliteracies interaction activities. I'll first provide a brief overview of how interaction has been conceptualized within perspectives of literacy and multiliteracies. I'll then explain several key motivations for this study before moving on to the context in which it was carried out and the methods for data collection and analysis. I'll present several key themes and findings from the data, and we'll end with a few implications and conclusions for pedagogy and research in multiliteracies. With the continuous development of digital technologies that allow for audio, video, text, and other media-based interaction, communication has become a multimodal act that calls upon the practice of multiple literacies. These ever-changing definitions of what it means to communicate have motivated scholars to explore how second language learners become more aware of the kinds of literacy that will support them while interacting in and with a variety of modes in the target language. According to Kern's seminal work in literacy and language teaching, the practice of literacy involves knowledge of how language creates discourse. Multiliteracies provides a way to engage in these various knowledge processes through texts and meaning design. To encourage speech surrounding these texts, for example, Paisani, Allen, and Dupuy suggest a four-stage model for scaffolding oral language use and establishing communities of practice in the classroom, which includes pre-speaking activities, textual interpretation, knowledge application, and summary and reflection. As I mentioned previously, though, the reality surrounding these processes and practice of literacy has yet another layer when considering the prominence of digital modes of interaction in the lives of language learners. Scholars such as Nobel and Langshire, Blotherington and Ronda, and Thorne and Reinhardt have discussed interaction and discourse as communication of meaning through digital tools and texts that align themselves with the social context they are used in. It also involves the element of collaboration, as well as the reality that communication occurs at different levels of immediacy. Moving now to the motivation for this particular study, these perspectives on literacy and literacy's practice have sparked an array of research avenues and criticisms, which in turn motivated the current study on the role of interaction in multiliteracies pedagogy. In recent analyses of instructor-created multiliteracies materials, Menke and Pisani discovered a tendency to overemphasize the role of experiencing and a need to better understand the interpersonal tasks that appear in these materials. Others, like Toms and Kern, who have explored the intricacies of both face-to-face and digital interaction, agree that there is still much more to be known about the complex nature of language that unfolds in the second language classroom. Analyses of the multiliteracies framework, such as those by Leander and Bolt, identify a general lack of attention towards spontaneity and improvisation that is inherent in literacy practice. My own observations in the classroom have included student-expressed anxiety and uncertainty towards speaking in class, as well as the less prominent role of digital modes of speech-like interaction in the curriculum. Menke and Paisani's analysis of instructor-created multiliteracies materials drew attention to the tendency to over-rely on activities that align themselves with the experiencing knowledge process. This knowledge process involves exposure to real-world texts which are relevant to students' lives, as well as learners' interests, prior experience, and existing knowledge. There are two parts of this particular knowledge process: experiencing the familiar or the known, which, for example, involves brainstorming about lived experiences, and experiencing the new, which could involve the introduction of a new genre. But what is actually happening while students interact during those experiencing activities? This study sought to explore what kind of interactional practices might categorize this knowledge process and how language educators might approach this knowledge process differently in multiliteracies pedagogies. This study sought to respond to three main research questions. What are the interactional affordances of experiencing activities that emphasize digital interpersonal language use? What kind of language use characterizes digital interaction that takes place during these kinds of activities? And to what extent does digital interaction facilitate language use that characterizes other knowledge processes? The pedagogical and research context for this study was a fourth semester intermediate German course that is the last course in the basic language sequence. It's also often considered the fairy tale course, since originally the primary texts were Grimm fairy tales. This course was recently redesigned several times based on a multiliteracies framework and now features other genres and focuses on the questions surrounding definitions of fairy tales and what it means to be fairy tale-esque. To provide a new kind of experience with the texts in which students could interact with and from different perspectives, I designed three multiliteracies-based simulation weeks in which students chose and embodied a character from a Grimm fairy tale. These simulations also involved preparation days to get students ready to interact during the simulations and post-simulation reflections in which they reflected on their interactions and experiences during the simulation. Students adopted characters in this simulation and were new inhabitants of the fairy tale community in the actual German city of Kassel. To simulate this community, students engaged in a variety of in-class and online writing and interaction-based activities, such as profiles that they posted on the neighborhood app, which was a WordPress site. Digital interaction occurred both asynchronously and synchronously through comment threads on the profiles they created, digital social reading activities, and Google Hangouts chats. In this presentation, I focus particularly on the Google Hangout chats, as this study sought to provide insight on interpersonal tasks occurring through the knowledge process of experiencing. These chats were done as homework at the end of simulation weeks 1 and 2 and involved a series of prompt questions, which were meant to encourage talk about the experience of the simulated context and the texts they viewed and read. These questions are marked in bold here. There were several questions that were meant only to remind students to think about how digital conversations are typically structured, such as how they begin and how they end. These are italicized in the table. And several others were included in order to afford interpretive, conceptual, and analytical talk about topics like the moral of the fairy tale film they viewed, whether or not the texts contained typical elements of a fairy tale, and to think about whether or not they agreed with the opinions of their partner. Data analysis was informed by conversation analysis and discourse analysis, which assisted in the creation of a coding system based on the interactions students had. Several codes helped to describe discourse structure, like openings and adjacency pairs, while others indicated practices that have been attributed to experiencing texts, like opinion uttering, topic introduction, and negotiation. Others identified practices associated with processes of conceptualizing and analyzing, such as interpretation, perspective taking, word search, repair, and affirmation. There were several codes that were applied specifically to digital interactions, which indicated instances of multimodal interaction through emoji, written emotions and reactions like haha and lol, images, and URLs to other internet content. As you can see in this table, opinion uttering dominated the kinds of interaction and interactional practices that were occurring during students' chats. Looking into it a bit further, though, opinions often created additional opportunities for students to engage further with meaning through other kinds of language use, like interpretation and perspective taking. And the ways in which participants carried out digital interaction presented significant differences from how they may have done it in face-to-face. Participants often paraphrased or completely reworked the prompt questions in order to introduce topics, for example. Perspective taking was focused more on the modern reality of their characters during digital interaction in Kassel rather than on the background and past experiences that they created for them. Surprisingly, participants relied primarily on text to make and express meaning. In fact, 11 of the total 15 instances of emoji that you see in this table came from one participant. To illustrate how these instances were analyzed, I'll talk through just a few examples. Digital spaces proved particularly facilitative of a move from experiencing through description and expression to analyzing meaning within and behind texts. While talking about a film version of The Little Red Riding Hood made in the 1960s in East Germany, Rumpelstiltskin and Königssohn, a character from Snow White, for example, took their conversation deeper than the question of what the moral was and whether or not it shared a moral with the Grimm version of the story. After explaining that they did not think the film presented a new moral, Rumpelstiltskin speculated on the ways in which the film reflected the political situation in East Germany during the 1960s. By using inquisitive language like the verb sich wundern, or to wonder, they opened the floor for interpretation. Although Rumpelstiltskin did not make an inference on this topic, they did create an opportunity for interacting around the text on a deeper level than description. As I mentioned previously, perspective taking in digital interaction tended to focus on the current realities of their characters in the simulation and how they related to the text they experienced. In this example, Hansel from Hansel and Gretel and their partner were discussing the simulated film night where they viewed the film version of Little Red Riding Hood and were talking about what kinds of films they would like to see featured at the film night in the future. After their partner suggested a film with Leonardo DiCaprio, Hansel connected their own persona to the comment. This was also an example of how emoji, although less commonly used, supported participants in creating visual representations of their reactions during digital talk. A different pair of participants talked about the likelihood of watching the film again. Zauberin, or the sorceress from the story of Rapunzel, went beyond an evaluative yes or no answer and explained that they could watch it with their new roommate in their new apartment in Kassel. They also kept this perspective while taking their leave, explaining that the dinner they were going to eat was from their garden, playing on the fact that the witch in Rapunzel is often depicted as having quite a large garden. Looking now to some implications and conclusions based on the data that were collected in this study. Findings suggest that experiencing within digital interaction often took the form of expressing opinions, but it's perhaps more important to note that these digital spaces were particularly facilitative of reflection on and interpretation of text through interactional practices of perspective taking. This perspective taking often connected the lived experiences that learners developed for and as their characters based on the texts they came from with the texts they encountered in Kassel and the modern realities they experienced there. The reliance students exhibited on the use of written speech and punctuation to express emotion is potentially a limitation of this study, as students may not use the Google Hangout platform as often as other messaging apps and platforms. It does suggest, though, that they were creative and deliberate in their design choices, perhaps from the perspective that this is a speedy chat rather than a publicly displayed interaction that requires more visuals, such as those on Facebook. This study also suggests the potential of paying closer mind to the practice of interactional literacies in the second language classroom, as it can work to inform how students navigate to and from the various knowledge processes that multiliteracies pedagogy seeks to support. Things to consider include the wide range of orality, synchrony, and modalities that can and should be emphasized in language learning, how the knowledge of conventions and other elements help to gain access to interaction, the various kinds of active engagement with text through interaction, as well as the interactional practices that manifest themselves during those activities. Additional research and pedagogical examples will provide a more complete picture of whether or not and the extent to which digital interaction supports learners as they engage in perspective taking and other analyzing and conceptualizing oriented activities. Because the chosen platform in this study may have discouraged learners' use of visuals and other forms of digital expression, future research and pedagogical implementations of multiliteracies interaction activities might consider popular multimodal applications like Snapchat or Instagram stories. Finally, as many of us had to make an abrupt switch to emergency remote instruction and are now teaching entirely online or in hybrid contexts due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it's crucial that we work to understand in more depth how learners are practicing interactional literacies and the ways in which we as instructors can provide opportunities for this through our pedagogical designs in online settings. Thank you all again for joining me for this session, and I welcome any questions you might have during our synchronous discussion or our live discussion. So please do join me on October 22nd at 10 o'clock for a live discussion about this study. We can all practice our digital interactional literacies together in an online setting. I'm very much looking forward to it, and please do feel free to contact me with any questions you might have. Thank you.